doing recording in progress, to make sure that we valued their time and their effort and their work that they were giving to us, right? As we all get paid to do this work every day, recognizing that when we ask people to come in and help us do that, we also have to value their time and understand it as work to be valued. So just to summarize this, the vision of this work group was that the needs of disproportionately impacted low-income communities and communities of color, that those needs are addressed through an equitable distribution of ARPA funds. And the mission of this group was to establish priorities, metrics, accountability measures for the use of ARPA funds towards the recovery of those same communities, Black, Indigenous communities of color, and other low-income communities, and to ensure that as we were making these investments, that we're also really nourishing effective community partnerships that are rooted in racial equity to ensure broad access to ARPA funds. Next slide. So we've been working with this group of folks and an amazing group of consultants who are really helping us to center race equity, to develop high-level funding areas, to present these recommendations to our board of supervisors. And as we're doing that, we recognize the need and the importance for us to learn and apply an anti-racist, results-based accountability approach, so to make sure that we're really achieving the racial equity principles that are embedded in ARPA legislation. We're talking about ARPA is a really beautiful example of legislative leadership, right? It kind of says, we're going to accept at the ground floor that there was disproportionality in the way that we experienced this pandemic. So we don't have to argue about that as we think about how we're implementing this legislation. I think it's an excellent example of kind of equity leadership in legislative intent and how you actually roll that out inside of a piece of legislation. We're also really lucky that we have a county race equity and social justice strategic planning pillar that also helps guide our work and direct our resources in this way. So developing these new skills was challenging because we're also moving at warp speed. I'm realizing that as I'm talking so fast because this has all been moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And that's challenging, right? That urgency and that speed that we're moving at, that doesn't typically help us to build those strong community connections. And so we really had to provide some structure and some resources underneath that so that we could move as quickly as we needed to with this process with our community. So we asked folks to really identify issues and problems, but also to understand the why, right? We're getting at the root causes, the underlying causes of how what we're seeing like comes out at the top level, but we really got to get underneath it. And our goal here was recognizing that if we chose a superficial route, right, we wouldn't make a deep impact. And if we set a route that kind of sits deeper and emerges and manifests itself by showing those different negative symptoms, that's where we can really make an impact. So we also recognize if we go down and said, like, let's solve racist capitalism, like we weren't going to get anywhere with this process, right? So we really had to sit in this place that was very productive and recognize that with these one-time kind of limited funds that we were really needing to identify some mid-level routes and linking the why to the solution. Next slide, please. The other thing that I just want to mention here is how critical it was for us to be grounded in data and to be connected to our health department and our incredible team of epidemiologists who really helped ground us in, the impacts of the pandemic on specific populations. And so again, recognizing that we needed to do a significant amount of work to get folks in the same space and understand kind of what the impacts were in communities. We really asked, so we're kind of grounded in that work that our epidemiologists did. And so we start with this map on the left-hand side that shows you the geographic areas where COVID really hit our community, right? And then we move over into looking at how that layers where we're looking at HDI, right? And HDI is a really important thing for us to consider because it's an index that combines many different ways to measure health and well-being. And we see that those areas that have kind of darker lines around them, those are places that experience kind of lower quality of life, right? Lower HDI scores. Those areas that are not as impacted by COVID, by those hotspots, you can see that they're lighter. So we're trying to get and move our community as a whole, our decision makers, our community members, to recognize that these are really structural, kind of deep entrenched issues that we have to recognize and understand as holistic in terms of then being able to find solutions to those challenges. Next slide. And the last thing that we did here was look at kind of geographic case distribution, HDI, how that sits on top of it, and then HPI, right? And HPI is an important index in California because, you know, one of the challenges with doing non-race neutral work or race forward work is Prop 209. And so HPI allows us to kind of sit outside of race and ethnicity and use proxies like income, education levels, many other different indices to really get at those proxies for race, but recognizing that all of those things are just proxies, right? They're just proxies for race. And so sitting in this recognition of, you know, our structural and institutional challenges that created these disproportionate outcomes during COVID was really important for us. At the same time, it was really critical for us to also sit and recognizing that these numbers and these stats and these statistics have to be humanized, right? COVID created such isolation and such segregation in our communities. So people were really kind of stuck in their own little boxes. You know, for those of us who have the privilege of being on Zoom to do our work, right? Being home and trying to homeschool kids or take care of family members at the same time that you're Zooming 8 to 10 hours a day, that's hard. But that was our very narrow window of the world for a long time. And what was really challenging in this process, and what was a beautiful challenge, was to make sure that we were, you know, providing this kind of information to our community as a whole to say, that was not the biggest challenge during COVID for so many community members that we really need to be thinking about and centering as we're making these decisions. And so nailing down into some very tough and very emotional data points, you know, really recognizing that people's life expectancy has changed by race in significant ways in Sonoma County. That Latinx people are 10 times more likely to die prematurely from COVID than white people in our community, right? We're really trying to kind of push down and take a moment as a community as a whole to be emotionally intelligent about our need to humanize this data and understand that these maps and these little dots and these outlines are people. And they're people who really need us to see them in a different kind of a way with this process. Next slide, please. Oscar.
Thank you, Alegria, and thank you for grounding us in the fact that all of this work is really about people and about making sure that these investments go to those hardest hit by the pandemic. As Alegria mentioned, we really wanted to ground ourselves in data, data that we could present to the community and build a baseline for what our community needs were and where we need to go. So in partnership with the Economic Development Board, they updated their COVID-19 economic impact study to really identify which of the industries were hardest hit by the pandemic and which are the ones that still need to recover to inform where we might make some investments. So this was data that was procured through a consultant and was presented to our community. Next slide. Again, we also shared with our community members some of the challenges that our communities was facing, which of the sectors were hardest hit. We know that tourism, hospitality, retail, some of our agricultural workers did not have the luxury of being able to work from home. And it's important to understand and think about how might we create an equitable recovery and where might we direct some of those resources, especially in communities and occupations that were hardest hit. So this was valuable information to help us really make sense of what is happening from an economic development perspective. Next slide. We also leveraged some of the experiences that the EDB utilized in some of their tactics during the CARES Act distribution of funding. They did a really good job in engaging their community, different stakeholders, different groups, different minority-owned businesses. And so we didn't have to start from the beginning. We leveraged what they've learned through their process and built upon that for our ARPA engagement process. Next slide. I'm speaking fast, being mindful of how 20 minutes goes by really quick. So one of the things that we did is we wanted to really get a sense of, from a geographic perspective, what was happening in these various different communities. And so we hosted, in partnership with each of our county board of supervisors, these district meetings starting in September, where we basically, educated our community participants around, what is ARPA? What are the uses of ARPA? Why did it come to be? Then we wanted to really help people understand sort of the data. So we had and presented data from the health, from the economic, and some from the social services, and from our community-based organization, talking about some of the challenges that they were facing. Once we did that, we went through a process of actually engaging in conversation. We didn't just want to have a conversation that was about presenting data, but we really wanted to understand what people were feeling and experiencing on the ground. But I wanted to just quickly share some of the tactics we use for our outreach. So we can go to the next slide. Again, we wanted to leverage every existing and possible system that we have in place at the county. I call those sort of the formal structures. You know, we have our county websites, we have social media. We distributed this information to all of our departments and asked them to distribute it to their CBOs and organizations that they work with. And we also use our informal processes. Alegria mentioned the ARPA Equity Work Group. These are people that are in community that have an informal network where word of mouth is actually very important and is a really good way of accessing information. All of our information was printed and distributed in English and Spanish, and all of our town halls were translated into English and Spanish. And we also made it a point to have a Spanish-only work group to really allow people to express themselves and to share their experiences in their language of choice. So that was very important. And we heard some really heartfelt experiences of how people were dealing with COVID. Next slide. I just wanted to briefly share some of the questions that we asked of our participants. So at these town halls, we broke out into work groups. There was a facilitator and a scribe. And these are the kinds of questions that we asked. We didn't just want to have quantitative data, but we wanted to focus on the qualitative. How are people experiencing COVID? What's going on in their families? What are the challenges that they're facing? How are their neighbors doing? How are their neighborhoods? To really paint a picture of need. We also wanted to hear from our community members around, if you've accessed services during the pandemic, what is working well? Where have you experienced barriers? And what might we do different to make sure that our systems and services are responsive to the needs of our community? So this was very rich and important information that helped to inform our process. Next slide. And here's sort of a summary of what we heard back from these town halls and from the community surveys that we sent out. We heard a lot of feedback around the need to continue to support our community with direct cash assistance. People are still hurting. They still need access for food. We know that our childcare sector was decimated. Many of our childcare facilities had to close. Many of our in-home childcare providers are no longer operating. And so this is an area that continues to be a huge challenge. And if we want to get people to get back to work, we have to make sure that they have access to childcare. We also heard a lot about the need to continue to provide rental assistance and rental supports, housing related assistance, and to continue to support our small businesses, particularly our BIPOC businesses who did not have access to a lot of the PPP money that was available during the CARES Act funding. So this is very important information that we collected from our community and from the surveys. And part of our task now is to summarize it and to make and to put it into priority buckets that we will present to the board in December. And now I'll turn it back over to Alegria to continue this discussion around what we heard from our community.
Thank you, thank you. Next slide, please. So to Oscar's point, right? Prioritization. One of the things that we're really working on doing and it is to elevate the voices of community members and to really kind of share deeply with our community as a whole what this feels like for certain folks. We still have a significant number of people who don't actually realize that if you're undocumented, you didn't get a cent of stimulus money, that you don't qualify for unemployment insurance, right? That it's very difficult for you, if you're undocumented, to actually have medical insurance coverage for yourself and your family. And so, as we're thinking about, instead of creating those populations that they're like, oh, they're hard to reach, or they're, we've actually pulled them right into the middle of our design process. And those are the folks that we're centering. as we're talking about, how we're prioritizing the way that we're spending this money and for whom we're designing, right? Recognizing that as local government, we have a very particular role of needing to slide in to patch the safety net that other institutions that also create some real challenges in the way that they design and the way that they exclude people who, again, were disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. So these are some of the, the voices that we really wanted to make sure we're in the mix as we're thinking about how we're designing our programs and allocating these resources. Next slide, please. I think there's like 2 clicks on this one, maybe 3. There you go. Okay. So I promise we're wrapping up. This is a little bit of what came out of our ARPA equity work group, right? So again, thinking about how we're elevating those voices from our community with this lived experience. And so we're really kind of like trying our best to do the work that, is best laid out in this quote from this cool guy, Glenn Martin, who's the founder of Just Leadership USA, which is about kind of community engagement and recognizing that those folks who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution, and they tend to be furthest from resources and power. So what we're trying to do with our process is really kind of flip that, right? And recognize that when we get close to the folks who are really dealing with the deepest challenges in our community, they are the ones who need to have the resources and power to direct the resources where they need to be, right? And so these are some of the priorities that came out of that work group. And one of the things I just really want to elevate is look at the richness, right? And the wealth and the asset frame that comes from communities recognizing that they have so much to do here with us as our partners. And so I think there was just a real kind of excitement and some newness around the kind of information that we're getting and the kind of ideas that have come out of this. That it's going to be really fun as we, figure out how to make sure that this federal funding, which can be highly, tough to work through and tough to push through the right pipes, right? That's going to be our work in the inside of the county, is really to kind of build those bridges between what the community solutions are and how simple it is, like expand our promotoras networks, right? Ooh, how are we going to get federal funds to not a 501c3, an informal community group, right? So these are some of the challenges that we've recognized and the community has now also recognized we have as we think about how to push up this money. Next slide. Oscar.
Okay, and in closing, I'll do 2 slides with one. I just wanted to share a very high level of our process. So we are done with our community engagement. We will be presenting to our Board of Supervisor the totality of our findings and a summary of the priority investment areas based on all of the feedback that we've collected, based on all of the data and reports that we've looked at. And once they give us their blessing, we are going to develop an RFP process and put it out to the community sometime in the beginning of 2022. We're also doing something a little different in that we're implementing the results-based accountability framework to really understand from this ARPA investment, how much are we doing? How well did we do it? And as a result of these investments, is anybody better off? Or did we help those who were most disproportionately impacted? We've also have a system in place where we're going to do quarterly monitoring of our CBOs and work with them to make sure that their programs are trending in the right direction. And if they're not, we're going to sit with them and figure out how might we tweak the program to make sure that we are achieving the results that we want. This is all technical assistance that the county is providing to our community-based organizations, because we recognize that if we have a successful, vibrant, thriving nonprofit sector, then that makes these dollars much more impactful and will get us the results that we want. So we'll end it there. We're happy to answer any questions that the participants might have regarding this process.
Thank you, Oscar. I don't know if you wanted to cover this slide at all or just end it there.
Really quickly, this is just about, again, the process that we're going to release an RFP. We're going to provide technical assistance, really, particularly to our smaller nonprofit organizations who don't normally apply to county dollars. So we want to actually be there to support them and to help them with that technical assistance so that this can be a low barrier experience for them, because we recognize how important their work is in the community. And then we intend to release the funds in late spring.
Great, thank you. Excellent. Well, thank you, Oscar and Alegria. This is an excellent example of this work and how to really embed equity and public engagement into this process in a very meaningful way. And so before we move on to questions, we want to kind of combine questions and have Corey from Polko go next and share with us as well. And then we will do Q&A at the end. So meanwhile, if you have any questions that you want to make sure you don't forget, put them in the chat for the County of Sonoma folks, and we'll make sure to answer them at the end of the two presentations. Excellent. Thank you both. Really appreciate your insights and experience. All right, Corey, I'll hand it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to my co-panelists from Sonoma County. You guys have really got an excellent comprehensive way of tackling a really difficult subject. And I so appreciate the work that you're doing. And it set a very nice standard for me to kind of jump in and talk about some of the other things kind of that we're seeing in this space. If you can go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that we really have to look at when we're looking at anything having to do with this, as you know, again, so well pointed out, is this is a public trust issue that has got deep roots in historical marginalization of different groups within our society. And as a result, we really can't look at any of this stuff without kind of looking at it through that trust lens. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do real quick is go ahead and just give you some of that data that we have regarding trust. It just so happens, so our organization, we do a lot of different surveys, scientific surveys. One of the ones that we do is a National Police Services survey. We happened to do this during the summer of 2018 and then also the summer of 2020. And so these were just some general questions that we asked national panel. We went through and we weighted it by things like rent versus own, race, ethnicity, gender within each region to kind of look at what some of the results were. Next slide, please. So if we're looking at changes in public trust, and I think that probably none of this is a surprise to any of us, but it is important though to know the numbers because we can't fix what we don't measure. And so these are some of the measurements that we're able to show. The drop in trust in police between when we looked at this at 2020 and 2018. Again, huge drops in the way that we look at this, 20 to 25%, which is well beyond anything that honestly, I think we even really expected. Next slide, please. Disparities indicated in the ratings. And again, probably no great surprise here. Residents are more positive towards the police, tended to be older, living in single family homes, higher income, male. Results were mixed by race and ethnicity. One of the things that we found was that some of our people who were of Asian, were actually more trusting of the police, certainly than our friends who were Black. There was definitely some mix in terms of race and ethnicity there in terms of the results. Next slide, please. So something else I want to look at real quick is looking at the trust in police. And it's actually rather interesting because again, we're looking at this Black residents and white residents, looking at the difference between 2018 and 2020. And you will have these slides later. So I think one of the fun things with data is to be able to kind of dig in and look at it later. But there were some really interesting things that came out of this. And I hope that you have an opportunity to get in this and look at it a little bit more later. But overall, we saw some understanding among our white residents as well, that there were some real issues that needed to be dealt with in our society. Next slide, please. The other thing too to look at in this is trust in state and local government. And this is kind of a historical view of this. And this actually comes from Gallup. And if you look at this, overall, local government has always had more trust than state government. And that's been pretty stable over time. However, both state and local government took a dip at 2020 into 2021. Next slide, please. So the big question we have to ask is, where do we go from here? Next slide. So I want to go through and talk about some strategies to better engage all of our residents for budgeting. Next slide, please. First of all, we need to identify who are those that we have found, based on our research, are the least likely to engage with government. And so, again, no big surprise here. They tend to be low income. They tend to be younger. They tend to be undocumented. They tend to be people of color. They tend to be people with limited English proficiency. One of the things that actually is a little bit of a fallacy, we actually don't necessarily find that older people overall are less engaged. A lot of times they actually are homeowners. and other things. So they actually are pretty engaged in the community, and are more likely to exercise, by voting and by taking surveys and stuff like that. So certainly not, we can't generalize about that population as a whole, but overall, that is a little bit of a fallacy. Next slide, please. We also need to look at what some of those barriers for civic engagement are from a resident's perspective. Lack of time, absolutely one of them. A lot of times when things are going on, council meetings and things like that, they may be taking place during a time when it's difficult to get to. If you've got a parent with kids, people working second shift, lack of time can be a real issue. Limited accessibility or understanding of local government, especially when we're talking about maybe residents who have come from other countries where they faced persecution. They may have even more distrust of local government than people who have been born here, because they may have been actively persecuted before they came to the United States. So understanding of local government, they may have actually been the local government persecuting them. Privacy and anonymity. People want to make sure that what they say is going to be anonymous. Political climate. I don't think I probably need to go real far into that. We are politically divided right now. That's a real barrier. People are afraid to express their opinions. Meetings can be intimidating. Getting up in front of a whole lot of people, or even just sitting among a group of people who may not come from the same background that you do, that can be really intimidating. And then the effort. For a lot of people, being able to go and to engage can, a focus group is like that, while really helpful in terms of the information gathered, can be really difficult when people are juggling multiple jobs, children, maybe older relatives, all of those things that can go along with it. Next slide, please. We also, though, have to really understand the value of resident input. It helps to define that desired return on investment. It increases transparency and accountability. And when we're talking about trust, these are just some things we absolutely need to hit on. We have to be transparent in order to gain trust, and we have to be accountable, because that's the only way to change what are some of the historical practices. Guidance on tax tolerance, that's really important. And again, it's a way to build some trust. And then also perspectives can enhance projects. If the only people that we are hearing from are people who are more likely to show up to city council meetings and do some other things like that, it really is we're not understanding the really important perspectives of all of the people who live in our communities, all of whom have got opinions that are extremely important for us to listen to. Next slide, please. So why engage for ARPA? So there's a whole lot of really good reasons to do it that I believe that my colleagues from Sonoma have gone through, but let's just get down to basics here. Treasury guidance is that you need to. They are urging local governments to engage constituents and communities in developing plans to use those payments. They're looking for engagement as part of this. Next slide, please. And they also want us to engage all of our residents. So they are specifically looking to make sure that we are also hearing from some of those traditionally marginalized communities, because they understand that the impacts of the pandemic have fallen most severely on communities and populations that were already disadvantaged. So when we're going through and we're looking at spending ARPA funds, we really need to look at it in terms of being able to document our efforts at outreach and engagement with some of the communities that may not be heard from as often. Next slide, please. So what are some best practices on this? And I'm going to go through these real quick, just mindful of time, because I want to make sure that we have some time for this. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So we need to engage our community. And I'm back again on our police services survey. And again, I'll send these to you, but one of the things to look at in this, priority that changed from 2018 to 2020, increasing connections with the community and increasing resident accessibility to the police. Residents are saying loud and clear that they want to have more engagement with local government and with their police. Next slide, please. You also have to be accessible. The way that we are able to do this, it is not enough to set up a meeting and have people come. We have to be boots on the ground. We have to be going out to communities, and we have to be doing it in a way that's culturally appropriate. We can't go through and expect that people who are not from that community are going to be able to do it. But at the same time, though, our leadership needs to be seen as well. So we need to kind of walk that line then between making sure that things like our mayor, our city manager, our chief of police, some of the biggest increases we are seeing in terms of trust comes from simply getting out and talking to the community, actually getting through and walking the blocks, talking to residents, finding out what's going on. Next slide, please. You also have to build relationships, because when do you need those relationships with the community leaders? You need to build them before you need them. Next slide. You also need to continually ask for feedback. There is a higher reliance on technology, and one of the silver linings of COVID is the fact that people now are used to being online. Certainly not all of our populations, but one of the things that we found with COVID was that we for the first time do have computers sometimes in homes that have never had them before, and we have expanded access to internet, and again, things that we have never had. We need to take advantage of the fact that we now have got some additional resources available and some assets we didn't have before. We also want to make sure that we're doing it shorter and more frequently, that it's part of a routine, and that we are really going ahead and we're making sure that we are making specific efforts to be inclusive of all of our community and not just specific segments. One of the things we want to do is we want to make sure we have larger samples. The more people we hear from, the more likely they are to become representative of our community. We also want to use panels. Panels can be really helpful, because if you are able to get in and to gain trust with some communities that may not have been trustful before, if you can continue to engage them, you can continue to get perspectives that may not be readily apparent. And then you also need to go ahead and close the feedback loop. Next slide, please. One of the things that is an absolute must anytime we're looking for feedback, and again, you can look at this yourself, it absolutely has to be mobile responsive. 76% of people with a household income of less than $30,000 do have access to a smartphone. Must be mobile responsive. Next slide. And then we just need to continually ask for feedback and learn from the COVID response. We can have online interactions that allow more of the community to participate. One of the things that we're finding out is that especially among younger people, they seem to be more likely to engage in things like online survey, as do communities of color. A lot of times they can be really difficult to engage. Overall, the number of people engaging in surveys are going down, but online interactions can really increase that. And you can use, we call it snowball sampling, where you go ahead and you have one person who takes a survey and you encourage them to share that with their friends and family. That can really help you to get into some of the communities that have been historically difficult to engage, because you have a person with credibility in that community who is asking someone else to take a survey and to give input. That really carries some important weight. And then also always have a virtual component to the meetings, both in person and virtual. Again, a lot of times, some of our historically marginalized communities, they may have a lot of obligations that prevent them from being able to attend meetings in person. Make sure that there is some sort of virtual component, some way for them to be able to engage, regardless of whether or not they're able to do it in person. Next slide, please. So again, just some things to think about. Always share at least partial data. That's really important. Graphs and charts are easy to read, and it shows residents that their time is valued. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk really fast about Livermore, California. Next slide, please. Basically, if we're sitting here and we're looking at Livermore, California, they have been doing historically surveys since about 2003. It's part of their strategic planning process. But one of the things that they know now is that the citizen survey ultimately showed what residents are concerned about in a way that translates into city goals that we can actually work on. And this is important for us to keep in mind in terms of ARPA. Next slide. I'm pulling in some slides from the Great Recession, because right now in the data, what we're seeing is some similarities between some of the responses in the Great Recession as they were coming out and what we are seeing coming out of COVID and all of the everything else that was happening in 2020. So if we're looking at this, people were not really having we're not expecting to have their economic future positive as they were coming out of the economic recession. It's always been a desirable place to live and work, but they were seeing this and they were seeing the benchmarks and they were not happy with that. So what did Livermore do? Next slide, please. They went into a planning phase and they decided that they wanted to make Livermore a better place to live and work. They wanted to enhance the downtown area, expand businesses, retain existing businesses, and allow for growth. Economic development was a huge focus for their funds and resources. Next slide, please. What happened, right? They informed and involved their community in things like what should be brought into downtown, bringing in new job opportunities, making sure that they were getting resident input all the way down the line. Next slide, please. And so then what happened? If we're looking at the results between 2011 and 2014, we were able to see great big jumps in terms of things like shopping opportunities, improvements as a place to work, positive income impact on personal income. Next slide, please. So if we're looking at this in conclusion, we have to look at public trust, and that has to be a part of what we're doing. That needs to be a goal of everything that we are doing, to engage, but to also show that we are trustworthy. It has declined in the last 2 years. We really need to fix that. It is important to do through equitable engagement, and special efforts need to be made to connect with all of our populations. And it's important that you engage with all the residents in your community, especially when you're using ARPA funds. Next slide, please. And with that, let's go to questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Corey. So thanks to all of our presenters. And I know we've got a few great questions in the chat. And also feel free to put any additional questions in the chat as well, or feel free to raise your hand. So again, thank you. I think, just kind of big picture, this using ARPA as an example of kind of how we want to be doing public budgeting, public decision-making processes across the board in local government is, a very key way to kind of infiltrate and kind of do the work that we have across the board. So we're very excited to have these examples around ARPA, but really knowing that it really, applies to everything that local government does. So thank you. So in terms of questions, let's see, there's a few more here. There's one from Mitzi. How have you tied this in with federal title, the non-discrimination requirements? I think that was one question, if anyone can answer that for Title VI. There are a couple that Alegria answered in the chat already, so thank you for that. So for the Title VI non-discrimination requirements, anyone have thoughts on that?
I think, just similar challenges in California under Prop 209. And so we're recognizing that, even if our laws and policies require us to be race blind, which is harmful to communities of color, then we can use proxies like geography, like income, because they are proxies, because our community in Sonoma County in particular, but many others in California are so segregated that it's sad that they serve as proxies, but they do. So we're in the process right now of really figuring out the criteria for eligibility, but we see kind of being able to layer, HUD opportunity zones, the census tracts that ARPA requires us to focus on, as well as, existing health and other data that we can really push in to say, these are the areas that we're going to focus on.
Great.
Oscar, would you add anything?
No, I think you hit it on the head. We're using also the Human Development Index to identify geographies or census tracts that have lower human development scores.
Great, thank you. And I saw, Alegria, that you answered a couple of the questions in the chat. If there's anything you want to add to as well, feel free to. Otherwise, we'll keep going. There was one question from Norma about who facilitated the town hall meetings. Was the Sonoma County Human Services Department staff? And
yes, yeah, it was done in partnership with Health Department, Human Services, Office of Equity, and Economic Development Board, and it was hosted by the supervisor for each of the districts. So they kicked off the meeting, and then we had our own internal staff that helped to facilitate and to capture all of the information from the focus groups.
Great, excellent, thank you. And then we have a kind of more of a comment from Michael talking about the public trust doctrine, where all California residents have a seat at the table. Yep, I think that's exactly what is important here. And any other final questions, feel free to put in the chat or raise your hand for our lovely presenters today. Okay. Oh, it looks like one person asked, what is the Human Development Index, or HDI versus HPI?
Sure, I will drop that back in. So those are two different indices. So HDI is what is used in the Measure of America, and what we're using in the Portrait of Sonoma update, which is a composite rating of overall well-being based on health, education, and income. And HPI is something that came out of kind of the public health field here in California, which combines 25 different community characteristics into a single index. And HPI and HGI both don't include race and ethnicity because of these anti-discrimination laws, which have been essentially bastardized to be used in the wrong direction. But it really allow us again to also pull those race and ethnicity issues in when we need to see with some specificity how those things are actually serving as proxies. So those are kind of like overall well-being indices that are used in different settings.
Excellent, thank you, Alegria. And I see one note from Angelica from Polko. Polko has created an ARPA engagement program designed around the Treasury guidelines, so feel free to check out that resource as well in the chat. And let's see if anyone has any final thoughts, questions, how this is going to be helpful for you in the work that you're doing. Feel free to put it in the chat. Otherwise, we want to say thank you for this, spending 1 hour with us and our amazing presenters sharing their experiences and their insights. So thank you to everyone. And also just continue to stay connected with ILG and all of our upcoming events and webinars, trainings, etc. We hope to see you at our future convenings as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye.